So I'm sharing the screen. Okay, so we are in risk management, and we have looked at plan risk management, identify task, qualitative risk analysis, plan risk responses, and control risk, right? So any questions so far on any of this? So remember that risk management is an important knowledge area. You can expect 25 to 30 questions from this area, and along with quality and procurement. These are the three tougher areas, and you can expect a lot of questions from them. So, okay, now we would take a step back and go to quantitative risk analysis. So remember, we skipped that. So we will see what is there in that, and what are the, when we will probably use this quantitative risk analysis. So quantitative risk analysis is an additional process step here, which is not always done. So in most of the projects, we would create a risk management plan, identify risk, identify the probability impact and the P&I metrics, and then come out with the risk responses. And of course, then you keep controlling the risk throughout the project. So this is what we normally do in regular projects. But there is an additional step of quantitative risk analysis which may be taken up in bigger projects or highly critical projects, or projects where there are too many high priority risks, etc. So why it is optional is because there is a additional cost involved in doing that quantitative risk analysis, and that may not be worth for most of the projects. But some projects, they might still go with that quantitative risk analysis. Okay, so let us see what are the elements in that. So I'm going to page 127. So quantitative risk analysis is a start process, 5 to 8 questions you can expect. So perform quantitative risk analysis is a process of numerically analyzing the effect of identified risk on overall project objectives. So whereas the previous step, the qualitative risk analysis, was focused on identifying individual risk and seeing what is the probability impact, quantitative risk analysis is mainly focused on the high priority risk, which you have identified in the last step, and what is the cumulative impact of those risks on the project. So that is what the main focus of the quantitative risk analysis is. So you can see that it is a next step to the qualitative risk analysis. So the first Q&A, is should perform quantitative risk analysis always be done in a project? The answer is no. At times, or most times, we will do plan risk responses directly after perform qualitative risk analysis. So directly from qualitative risk analysis, we will jump to the plan. Okay, so we would jump from here to here. We would skip the intermediate step, and that will be happening in most of the projects. The availability of time, budget, and project requirements will determine whether perform quantitative risk analysis has to be performed and to what degree. For example, in our role play, the risks were well defined and analyzed during the perform qualitative risk analysis, so we can go directly to plan risk responses. So whatever case we have seen in the first 2-3 processes, that is a very standard project. So whatever risk we identify in that case, we then go on to qualitative risk analysis and then risk response. So any standard projects, we would not do the quantitative risk analysis. Second Q&A, if conducted, should perform quantitative risk analysis be done on all risks? Again, the answer is no. It is usually conducted on risks which are categorized as high priority after the previous step. So if in our previous 2 steps, we have identified some 50 risks, but only 5 out of them are high priority, we will only consider those 5 for further quantitative risk analysis. This is because there are additional costs and expertise associated with performing quantitative risk analysis, so it need not be done on low priority risk. Perform quantitative risk analysis may be used to assign a numerical priority rating to risks individually, but it is most commonly used to evaluate the cumulative effect or aggregate effect of multiple risks affecting the project. And usually we are talking about high priority risk. So if there are 4 or 5 high priority risks, what will happen if all those high priority risks occur in the project? What is the cumulative impact? So though each risk may have its own impact, the cumulative impact may be bigger than the uh, individual impact if you just add it up. So that if all the risk occurs together, the impact would be actually bigger than the whatever impact is there individually for the risk. So that is what we are trying to look at it. So, but it is most commonly used to evaluate the aggregate effect of multiple or all risks affecting the project. It also presents a quantitative approach to making decisions in the presence of a lot of uncertainty. Data gathering and representation techniques such as interviewing and probability distributions can help quantify the effects of identified risks. For example, interviews can be used to gather expert and historical data to help quantify probability and impact data. So we can use interviewing and probability distributions to quantify the effects of identified data, identified risks. And interviews again are a very effective way to gather more details on the risk and get more quantitative data on the risk. So that is what can be used here. Next page is continuous probability distribution.
What's the second blank? For example,
Interviews. For example, interviews can be used to gather expert and data. Yeah. Okay. The next page, continuous probability distributions. Example, beta or triangular distributions are typically used to depict the results of modeling and simulation techniques such as Monte Carlo simulation. I think I showed you the demo, right, of the Monte Carlo simulation. So I showed you that, I think I've shown you that in quality or cost or somewhere, right? So the same Monte Carlo simulation can be used for this risk analysis also. So examples of continuous probability distribution output: range of cost impact on the project, range of schedule impact on the project, company revenues, etc. So I think in the example I will have shown you, I will have shown the range of schedule impact on the project, right? So there were 5 phases of a project, right? Define and I think the 5 6 sigma phases, right? And there were 3 values of the estimated duration for the phases. So that is the triangular distribution, and then we came out with the probability distribution, normal distribution for all those values. And then we saw, what is the probability that we'll complete the project within 120 days or 110 days or whatever, right? So that is the Monte Carlo simulation, and the same simulation can be used here for risk analysis. So quantitative risk analysis and modeling techniques: modeling, EMB, sensitivity analysis. So out of these 3 things, we have already seen the first one, that is the Monte Carlo simulations. We will see the EMB and sensitivity analysis, we will see as we go along. So first Q&A, you do a simulation of how different scenarios could impact the total project cost, and then analyze the cumulative distribution to assess the probability of the project costing different amounts given the cost risk considered. So what technique is this? So this is referred to as modeling. So what we try to do here is we try to simulate project conditions, saying that, okay, let's say out of the 5 high priority risks, 3 high priority risks occur, then what is the impact on the project? Out of 5 high priority risks, only 1 occurs, what is the impact? Out of 5, all 5 occurs, then what is the impact on the project? So that type of a simulation is done, that is called as modeling, and this can be performed using Monte Carlo technique or what if scenario analysis. So the 2 blanks there are Monte Carlo technique and what if analysis. Okay. Second Q&A. In your project, there is one negative risk that your senior developer may resign. The probability of that risk happening is 0.5. So now we are looking at the second technique, that is the EMV, expected monetary value. So in your project, there is one negative risk that your senior developer may resign. The probability of that risk happening is 0.5, and impact is expected to be $50,000. So let's say this is a high priority risk. And in the same project, there is also an opportunity that if the project is successful, you may get another much more lucrative project in the future. And the probability of that opportunity is 0.2, and the impact is $200,000. So what is the expected monetary value considering both the risks? So EMV is a technique where you look at multiple high priority risk and see what is the probability and impact, and then together you assess total impact. So EMV, what we do here is we multiply the probability and impact of each risk separately and then sum it up and putting the appropriate sign, plus or minus, depending on whether it's a negative risk or positive risk. So the first risk was a negative risk where we are saying that senior developer would resign. So the probability of that happening is 0.5, and the expected impact is $50,000. So this $50,000, we'll have to put a negative sign here, saying that it is a negative risk. The impact is negative. The second one is a positive risk. So the probability of getting that opportunity is 0.2, and the impact is plus $200,000. Okay. So this is the EMV calculation. So once we do this calculation, we will get some value. Okay, so that value is $15,000 plus $15,000. So the answer there, you can fill it up. You can put this formula, whatever I've shown here on the screen, note it down on that answer. So it is 0.5 into minus 50,000 plus 0.2 into 200,000. That is equal to 15,000. Okay, so this is the 15,000. So that is the answer there. That is a blank there. So this EMV technique is used when you have multiple high priority risks and each one has its own probability impact, and you want to see, what if 2 of the 5 risks occur, then we look at, what is the impact. If all the 5 risks occur, then what is the EMV? So usually we look at all the high priority risks and together, what is the EMV we calculate, and we see, cumulative impact. Suppose if there are 5 high priority risks and the EMV is turning out to be negative, and we know that in the end, basically, if all the risks occur, then the project is going to be in problem because EMV is negative, considering both positive and negative risks. But if the EMV is positive, then we can say that probably this project there is more benefit than loss if you go ahead, right? Because even if all the risk occurs, we will have a positive benefit out of this because the EMV is positive. So we could probably look in that way. Now, EMV can also be used for making decisions using decision tree analysis. So now we are going to look at using EMV technique for project selection. So in the cost management, we have looked at NPV and IRR, right? And other techniques, right, for deciding or project selection, basically deciding which project to go ahead with when we have multiple projects to choose from. So we can also use EMV technique for project selection. That is what they're saying here. So EMV has 2 benefits. One is we can use it for assessing the cumulative risks in a project, and EMV we can also use as a technique to do project selection. If we have multiple projects from which we have to select only one project. So here they have given in that diagram which project. There are 2 projects, A and B. The probability that A would succeed is 0.7, and if you succeed, you get a benefit of $200,000. If you fail, there is a minus $80,000 loss. The probability of failing is 0.3. So you can see the EMV calculation is done on the right. 0.7 into 200,000, that is 140,000, and then 0.3 into minus 80,000, that is minus 24,000. Similarly for B, the probability of it succeeding is 0.8 and probability of it failing is 0.2. and if it succeeds, then the benefit is $150,000. If it fails, it is minus $50,000. And again, the calculations are there. 0.8 into 150,000, that is equal to 120. 0.2 into minus 50, that is minus 10. So now we sum it up. So we sum up the top two values, 140 and minus 24. Then we sum up the bottom two values, 120 minus 10. So we get at the top 116,000 and bottom we get 110,000. So project A has got a slightly higher EMV compared to B, right? It is 116,000, whereas the bottom is 110,000. So, so we can probably go with project A, as a project selection criteria. If we use EMV, then we will say that we will go with project A because it has got a higher positive value. Any doubts on this EMV?
Yeah, Venkat. We subtract the original succeed value with the fail value, right?
I'm not able to hear you clearly.
We subtract the succeed value with the fail value, right?
Yeah, we subtract the fail value from the succeed. So if you see, it is 0.7 into 200,000, right? That is 140,000, and 0.3 into minus 80, so that becomes minus 24. So 140 minus 24. So the plus or minus is decided whether it is a gain or a loss in this case. So if it is a gain, then we are putting it as plus, which is in case of succeed. In case it's a fail, that means we are having a loss. We are having a loss of minus 80. So that is where we are putting a negative sign there. So we are subtracting that. Okay.
Got it.
Okay. Now next is what is called a sensitivity analysis and tornado diagram. So I will give an example here to explain this. So let us take this equation. Profit is equal to volume into selling price per unit minus cost per unit. So let's say there's a company which sells a product and they calculate the profit in this way, right? How much volume of product they have sold into selling price per unit minus cost per unit. So this is a simple formula for profit. Now let's say they want to come out with a estimate of how much they are going to make in the next 1 year. So they are trying to do some budgeting and they are going to come up with the next. Now these are the three factors which will impact the profit: volume, selling price per unit, and cost per unit. Right? These are the three things which will drive the profit. And for each one of them, they would have a 3-point estimate. Okay, so just like our PERT, we will have a 3-point estimate here. So let's say they expect in the next 1 year to sell a maximum of 10,000 units and a minimum of 5,000 units, but most probably they will sell around 7,000. So this is the mid or the base. Okay, so maximum they expect to sell 10,000, minimum 5,000, but the most probably they would sell 7,000. So that is the middle value. Then selling price unit, again that could be fluctuating, it may not be steady. So they can expect a maximum price of 1,500 for each product or a minimum of 800, and probably 1,200 is your mid value. Then cost per unit also, there could be fluctuation, cost for production of the product. It could go up to 1,000, or it could go down to 200, or mid could be 600. So let's say this is all in USD. That's what I put here, right? USD. So that means it's in dollars. So all the cost and selling price and cost is in dollars. So once we identify what are the drivers, and then we come out with the 3-point estimation, then we choose the midpoint as the base. So whatever is in yellow here, that's the base. Then we calculate the base profit by applying this formula for these values. So we say that 7,000 into 1,200 minus 600. So that gives me 4.2 million. So this is my base profit based on the middle values. Now what I will do is I will fluctuate only one of these three variables. So for example, volume. I will keep the selling price and cost per unit at my base and fluctuate my volume to 10,000 and 5,000. So I will take it up to 10,000 and bring it down to 5,000. So if I take it down to 5,000, my profit will go down to 3 million. If I take it up to 10,000, my profit will go up to 6 million, right? So all I'm doing is replacing in this formula volume with 10,000 and 5,000, whereas I'm keeping the selling price and cost is same, 1,200 and 600. So I'm getting these two values. Similarly, I fluctuate my selling price per unit, keeping volume and cost per unit in the base. Okay, and apply this same formula. So then what will happen is profit at minimum selling price per unit would be 1.4, right? That means if I'm able to sell it only for $800, then I will get a profit of 1.4 million. And if I'm able to sell it for 1,500, my profit profit at maximum selling price per unit would be 6.3 million. Then third one is cost per unit. So I fluctuate my cost per unit from between maximum and minimum. Keep the other two at the base. That is, volume and selling price will be at this base. So I get the profit value as 7 million for minimum cost, right? And for maximum cost, it will be 1.4. So then I put all these values in this table. So I'm saying that profit, min and max, when we fluctuate volume, selling price, and cost per unit. So this is what the values are there. Then I plot this curve. So this is called as a tornado graph or a tornado one. Okay, and initially when I plot, I may not get in this format. I plot it in such a way that the highest bar is at the top and the lowest bar is at the bottom. So the the factor which would fluctuate my profit the maximum is put at the top, and the factor which fluctuates my profit the least is put at the bottom. So this is the tornado diagram. So from here we can see that cost per unit can fluctuate my profit drastically. It can bring my profit to 1.4 million or take it up to 7 million. There's a huge range there. Whereas my volume fluctuation would fluctuate my profit only between 3 to 6. So it can bring down my profit to 3 million or take it up to 6 million. But the range is smaller than the 7 and 1.4. So we can say that from this analysis that the biggest risk to my profit is coming from cost per unit. That will have the biggest impact on my profit. Okay, so this is called as tornado diagram. And I think there is another example given in that page 129. Right? So if I go there, so they give an example of buying new hardware from China. Since you'll be buying some new hardware from China, foreign exchange risk is an important parameter. So you keep all other factors constant and try to determine the impact on the project if the Chinese yuan fluctuates at different amounts. So this is an example of sensitivity analysis, which helps determine the risk with the greatest possible impact on the project. So the blank there is greatest possible impact. The most common means of graphically depicting the results of a sensitivity analysis is a tornado diagram. So the two blanks there are. Greatest possible impact and tornado diagram. Okay. So here we can see that they have taken 6 risks. Risk 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and risk 1 is the one which is having the maximum variation on any factor, on whatever factor they are interested in, and the risk 6 has least impact on that factor. Right. So when we initially calculate these values, we would not know, which one is having the maximum impact and which is having so we have to look at it and then draw it accordingly so that it looks like a tornado, and then whatever is on the top is the most important risk that we have to consider. Okay, so perform quantitative risk analysis. The inputs are the risk management plan, which is coming from here. Right, risk management plan is coming from here. Then we have the cost management plan and schedule management plan coming from cost and time. The risk register is coming from the previous steps, that is identified risk. Then EAFs and OPAs again would be similar projects in this organization or in the industry. So if we have to do this type of analysis, EMD analysis, sensitivity analysis, We may need some input data, which we may get by looking at past projects. The output would be the project document update, which is the risk register update. So we update the risk registers. So that completes risk management. So now what you can do is go to page 135. Take 10 minutes to answer the questions and also check your answers. Yeah.
Yeah, Vikram.
So completed.
Yeah, completed. The second one,
Yeah.
in your project, the risk calculations show that there is a risk of overrunning the project scope and scheduled targets to level that are beyond the threshold limits determined in the project. To bring the level of risk or to the level acceptable to your organization, you should let little confused here like that.
Yeah. You have to use the contingency reserves to implement some risk responses. By using the contingency reserves, you are implementing certain risk responses to bring the project back into the threshold limits. That's what you're trying to do. So you have to basically implement, right? You have to implement the risk response, you need the contingency reserve.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, other questions are fine.
Okay. Fine. So now we go on to the page 137, the project procurement management. And like I said, this is also an important knowledge area. You can expect up to 30 questions from here. And there are 4 processes here: plan, procurement under planning, conduct under execution, control under monitoring and control, close under closing. So these are the 4 things. Okay. So project procurement management includes the processes necessary to purchase or acquire product, service, or results needed from outside the project team. Okay. So the first one is planned procurement management. So it's a star process. You can note 10 to 12 questions you can expect from this process. And this is a long process if you see. It is having many inputs and there are quite a few outputs here. Okay. So planned procurement management is the process of documenting project procurement decisions, specifying the approach and identifying potential sellers. So, but first of all, what is procurement? So let us try to see the overview of procurement. So when an organization identifies a business need and initiates a project, they have option to either do the project in-house or give it to some external vendor who will do it for them and provide them the deliverables of the project, right? So that is the in-source and outsource. Now if they decide to do the project in-house, that means in-source, that means they will have some team members from their own organization doing the project. So they will create a project team within the organization and do the project. But if they decide to give the entire project outside or even a part of the project outside, then the outsourcing comes into play. So what they'll have to do is they'll have to contact multiple vendors who are in the market who can do this type of work, provide them some initial details about what the project is about. So that is called as the RFP. And when they send the details to the multiple vendors, they have to send multiple things like SOW, source selection criteria, templates, NDA. So all this we'll see what are all these things. Once the vendors get all these details, they would prepare the response and send it back to the organization. And the organization would evaluate the vendor responses and choose one of them for a contract. Right? So that would be the process steps in procurement. And if you see, in most of the organizations, there would be separate departments to handle this procurement. The project manager's involvement will be very less. But the project manager has to be aware of what's happening here because it is going to impact the project. So if he's expecting a major deliverable from some vendor outside, he needs to know, how the procurement has happened and when they are expected to deliver, etc. So from that perspective, it is important the project manager is aware of the entire procurement process. So process 1, planned procurement management. Planned procurement management is a process of documenting project procurement decisions, specifying the approach and identifying potential sellers. So it identifies those project needs which can best be or must be met by acquiring products, service, or results outside the organization. So you are doing a project and let's say you need to build a website as part of the project and you think that it is better to go to some external software vendor who specializes in website design rather than trying to do it in-house. So you send the specifications to external vendors, select one of them, and ask them to develop the website for and give them maybe 3 months time, and they will design the website and give. Right? That is the approach that we take. The project manager often does not lead the procurement process, but must still be closely involved in order to ensure that the procurement contracts meet the objectives of the project. So the case study that we will consider in this knowledge area is: you are the director of training for Apex Services, an IT service provider. You have formalized the requirements for PMP certification for project managers in a company and selected PMstudy.com to provide in-house PMP exam prep training for all the project managers in your organization. Due to this partnership, number of certified PMPs tripled, project performance improved by 25%, and the PMO implemented number of improvements. Now a new CEO has come, and after an exhaustive business review, she determined that improvements were needed in the IT, customer service, and finance areas. To address the IT process issues, we recommend ITIL certification training for all the project managers and IT personnel. The ITIL is a set of best practices for ITSM that focuses on aligning IT services with the business needs. So you like to select a seller to perform ITIL foundation certification training to all project managers and IT service personnel. So you want to basically do a training for some of your resources on ITIL fundamentals. And the choice is either you can have an in-house trainer, maybe your organization has some trainers on ITIL, so they could do a training for the internal employees, or this type of engagement can be given to some external company or a freelancer, and they could come in and do the training. So in that case, it will be an outsource. So first Q&A is: how will you decide whether to outsource or insource, or whether to outsource or not? So that is the question there, to outsource or not. Okay. Through a make or buy analysis. The answer is through a make or buy analysis. So what it means is, suppose you want your organization as a business need for a software application, right? Now, what are the how they could go about it? So let's say our business need is a software application. Okay. Business need is some software application. Now, what are the choices the organization has got to procure this software application? Okay, one is they could make it in-house, okay, or in-source. That means they could have their own internal IT team who can develop this software application. So that is one approach, right? That is possible. Second is they could buy it from an external vendor. Buy it from external vendor. That means they just purchase it. Right? Third is they could lease it. So they could lease it from some external vendor. So today we have a lot of companies offering software as a service or a subscription, like Microsoft and other companies. They're offering many of their software products as a service, cloud-based. So you actually don't have to buy the product. You can just rent it for a few months and use it on the cloud, and then you give back the license right after the end of the period. So again, this would be leasing it from external vendor, or you make it by outsourcing. So you ask some external IT company to develop this application from scratch, right? So that is also possible. So if you see, these are the various approaches that can be taken, right, to satisfy that particular business need of a software application. So how do you decide whether to insource or outsource? You basically look at whether you want to make or buy analysis, right? And here you would look at what is the cost benefit analysis. So in each of these approaches, you will see what is the cost and what is the benefit of that approach, and also the organization capability. Suppose they want to make it in source, they'll have to see whether their IT team is capable of building the software application, right? All those things. So, what is the organization capability, and also what is the cost and benefit of each of these approaches? So, which is most suitable, they would go ahead. So, after make or buy analysis, we decide to outsource these three things: ITL, foundation training, software, and hardware. And these are our make or buy decisions. So make or buy decisions is, if a buy decision is made, then a further decision whether to purchase or lease may be required. So, so what we are saying is these two things, whatever we are seeing in the middle, is a part of the buy decision, right? So instead of making it ourselves, we are saying that we are going to procure the application from outside, and further, either we would purchase the license or we would lease the license. So those are the two options within that. So the blank there is, if a buy decision is made, then a further decision of whether to purchase or lease is also required. So first we see whether we want to make or buy, and so when we decide to make, we will further have to see. So how it works is, first we have to see whether we would make. If we have to make, then we have to see whether we want to in-source or outsource, right? So these are the two options. And if we say no, we don't want to make, we want to buy, then we'll again have to see whether we want to purchase or lease. So this is how we can uh, go with the step-by-step approach of deciding what approach we want. So next page, there is an example for purchase or lease. Okay. As part of the make or buy analysis, you want to determine whether to buy or lease computers. Now, buying a computer will cost $4,000 plus an annual warranty of $300. Leasing a computer will cost $1,500 per year with a down payment of $400. The length of time the computers are expected to be used will impact the decision on whether to purchase or lease them. So we need to find the point at which the cost of buying a computer equals the cost of leasing one, and then make a decision. So what is that point? So can you try to do this example? So just take 5 minutes, see if you can get the answer, then we will discuss.
Yeah, Venkat.
Okay, so
I'm not getting the formula. Can we go over it?
yeah. Okay, so here let's say y is the number of years. Okay, and if you are, let's say we do both the things for y years. Okay, let's say first we buy a computer and we use it for y years. Okay, so what will happen is the computer cost is how much? It is going to be $4,000 plus every year there will be a warranty cost of $300. So the 300 into y. So this is my cost for buying it. Now, so this is my buy cost. Then the second one is, let's say I'm going to lease the computer. So every year I'm going to spend $1,500. So it will be into y, correct? And there's also a down payment, one-time down payment of $400. So this is if I lease it. So this is my cost. Now I want to see for what value of y both will be equal. So I just put this is equal to this. Okay, so I just put this equal to this and then solve for y. So this will become 1,200 into y would be equal to 3,600. So y would be 3 years. So for when it is more than 3 years, you will see that buying is more beneficial because then this formula would be lesser than the formula on the right. But if the y is less than 3 years, the leasing will be beneficial because 1,500 to y plus 400 will be less than this one. So when it is equal to 3 years, both will be same, both will be exactly same. Okay, so your decision point will depend on whether you're planning to use the computer for less than 3 years or more than 3 years. If it is for less than 3 years, you lease it. If it is more than 3 years, we buy it. Is that clear?
Yeah.
Okay, so just note down. So there are 4 or 5 blanks there. So note down this. Just note down all these things in the blanks there. I hope there is no too much disturbance in my voice from this side because there is a lot of disturbance I get from your side. I hope my side is not, there is not much disturbance. Okay. So my voice is breaking sometimes, but do get disturbance? I hear too much of noise. No, okay, because I hear too much of background noise when when you unmute yourself. Okay, anyway. So just note down. Just take a minute to note down this. In that blanks. And the next line is if the computers are going to be used for more than 3 years. For more than 3 years, it will be financially beneficial to buy other than lease. Okay, so we move on to the next part. Another key output of the process is the procurement statement of work. which describe the procurement items in sufficient detail to allow prospective sellers to determine if they can provide the product, service, or results. And the procurement statement of work is developed from scope baseline, that is from the scope statement, WBS and WBS dictionary. So you can see that procurement statement of work is one of the important outputs of this process, and that is developed by looking at the scope baseline. Okay. Now you can you also create procurement documents. So procurement documents also are one of the outputs here, which are used to solicit proposals. So blank there is solicit proposals from prospective sellers. Procurement documents should include three things. First one is relevant procurement statement of work. Okay. Second one is desired form of response from sellers. Desired form of response from sellers. And third one is contractual provisions, your NDAs. Okay. And of course, there is one more here. So if you see SOW, statement of work, saying that, what is that we want to get from the vendor, then the desired form of response from sellers is nothing but a template. So what will happen is each vendor would tend to reply in their own format or in their own Word document format, etc. And if the organization has to go through all those different documents given by the vendors, they will not be able to understand. Each one is providing in their own format, and they will not be able to compare. So for that, what the organization will do, they'll prepare a template, response template, saying that all the vendors have to respond within this template only. And in that way, they can compare each section of how the different vendors have answered that section. And it's easy for them to compare and evaluate and decide on the final vendor. So that is the response template that the organization will create and send it across to all the vendors. And if the vendors have to use the template, if they don't use, they will be disqualified from the bidding process. Then NDA is the non-disclosure. So because what is happening here is when the organization is sharing the SOW, that is the statement of work, they are sharing many details about their processes, about their IT systems, etc. So they want to ensure that those information is confidential and it is not being leaked out by these vendors. So they will sign an NDA. They will make the vendor sign an NDA saying that whatever information they get from the organization, they would not distribute it further to anyone else. Apart from this, there is going to be a source selection criteria also, which will be one of the things that are going to be sent to the vendor. So we will see that shortly, what is there in the source selection criteria. Procurement documents are also referred to as RFP, RFQ, IFB, or RFI. So there are 4 different terminologies here. Okay, so what we are talking about is RFP, RFQ, RFI, and IFB. Okay. So what are the differences between this is, so RFP is request for proposal. So we are requesting for proposal from the vendors. Now RFP is what is normally used in software industry. So if an organization wants to build a software application, they would create an RFP and send it to the different vendors. And RFP would ask the vendors, vendors have to provide technical plus commercial details. So whatever SOW is there, looking at that SOW, the vendors will have to come out with what is the technical solution Okay, so they'll have to provide the technical solution. Now, whatever SOW is there, for that SOW, there could be different technical solutions possible. So different vendors could come out with different technical solutions. Okay, someone may use Java, someone may use .NET or some other technology and come out with the total different design, etc. So the technical solution would vary from different vendors, and that has to be specified. Plus, the vendors will have to say how much it is going to cost to do the project, right, the commercial part. So both the things are part of the request for proposal, and this is what is done in software. Request for quotation, that is RFQ. So this is the request for quotation, and here we are only asking for commercial. Usually, this is done for very standard, work. So, for example, usually governments go for such things. Let's say government wants to lay a water pipeline or somewhere in their municipality area. So they want to outsource that work to some local contractor. So they would ask the different contractors in that area to quote, to basically respond to their request for quotation. So different contractors would quote different prices, and whichever contractor quotes the least, most probably the government will go with that contractor. Now the contractor does not have to specify how they will do the work. It's a very standard work, because any contractor who gets that contract would do that work in that way only. So there is nothing different that any contractor can do. So the solution for that work is known and it's very standard. So there is no need for the vendor to specify how we will do the work. It's only the commercial part that is where the vendor, contractor would quote and get the project in case it quotes the least. So that is a request for quotation. And IFB, if you see, IFB is invitation to bid. So that is again similar to that. So IFB and RFQ are similar, or the same, you can say. Then we are talking about RFI. RFI is request for information. So here we are not asking for the vendors to bid for the project. We are just asking for information. So let's say the organization wants to develop a software application, but they're not sure to whom all they should send the RFP. So first of all, they would request a lot of vendors to provide information on what type of work they do. So they may send out a RFI to, let's say, 20 vendors, saying that can you provide details about your company, of what type of work you do, some testimonials, etc. And based on that, they would maybe shortlist 5 vendors for sending the RFP. Okay. And after they send the RFP to 5 people, then out of that they will select one. So we can see that RFI could be a step prior to RFP, but not necessarily always done. If a company already knows to whom they have to send the RFP, they may not do the RFI. But in some cases, they want to find some new vendors, they may go for RFI. So they will ask them to send details about their company, and based on that, they could send the RFP. So RFI is just requesting for information. RFP is requesting for proposal, which is both technical plus commercial. RFQ is requesting for quotation. IFB is same as RFQ, that is invitation for bid. So bid and quotation are used interchangeably. So when it say bid, it means quotation only. So again, the party is only not going to give a commercial detail. There is no technical solution. So invitation for bid and request for quotation are same. So the Q&A there is, what is the difference between bid, tender, quotation, and proposal? Terms such as bid, tender, or quotation. Okay. So tender also is the invitation for bid or tender. No, sometimes we use the word tender. So tender, bid, quotation. So all are having the same meaning. They are usually used when the seller selection decision is based primarily on price, as when buying commercial or standard items. while the term proposal is used when other considerations such as technical approach or capability are paramount. Example, software projects. Okay, so let me repeat that answer so that you get all the blanks. Terms such as bid, tender, or quotation are usually used when the seller selection decision is based primarily on price, as when buying commercial or standard items, while the term proposal is used when other considerations such as technical approach or capability are paramount. You also create source selection criteria to rate the sellers. So source selection criteria is done to rate the sellers. The rating criteria can be objective or subjective. Okay, and the source selection criteria will be part of what is sent to the vendors. So what all will go to the vendors? The SOW, which is statement of work, saying that what is that we want the vendor to work, do the work. Then on what basis the vendor will be selected, that selection criteria should be shared transparently so that every vendor knows exactly on what basis they would be accepted or rejected. And then the template in which the vendor has to respond, and non-disclosure agreement saying that do not disclose anything about what the organization is sharing with you with anyone else, right? So those are the things that are going to the vendors. So if you go to the next page, there is a sample criteria with their applicable weights are shown. Okay, so for a training institute, they are looking at money back guarantee, past experience with seller, number of trainers, scores from sample evaluation of the course, etc. And they can give a weightage from 1 to 5. Okay, so it could be 5 to 4, etc. So for each procurement item, an appropriate contract type will be considered. Contractual agreements are OPS that influence the planned procurement management process. The risk level of the buyer and seller is determined by the contract type chosen. Okay, so now we will look into the different contractor, but before going there, any questions so far what we have done? Okay, fine. Okay, now what are the common contract types? There are 3 types. You can see fixed price contracts, cost reimbursable, time and material contract. Fixed price contract is where oh, okay, we can stop here. Yeah, fine, sure. So we will stop here, and so the next class will be on Wednesday. Okay, so I think Sumit also should be back by then. Okay, fine. So see you on Wednesday then.